An Apology for Poetry, by Sir Philip Sidney is a significant work in the realm of literary criticism, addressing the value and purpose of poetry in a time when it faced criticism from various quarters. Here are some of the most important questions about this work, along with detailed answers. 1. What is the central argument of Sidney's An Apology for Poetry? Answer. In An Apology for Poetry, Sir Philip Sidney defends poetry against its detractors by presenting it as a valuable and noble art form. Sidney's central argument is that poetry serves a unique and crucial role in society that other forms of art and literature cannot fully fulfill. He contends that poetry is not merely an entertaining or frivolous pursuit but a powerful tool for moral and intellectual improvement. Sidney addresses the criticism that poetry is a source of moral corruption by arguing that it has the potential to cultivate virtue rather than vice. He draws a distinction between poetry and other forms of writing, such as history and philosophy, by emphasizing that poetry combines the imaginative and the didactic in a way that can make moral teachings more engaging and memorable. Poetry, according to Sidney, has the ability to present moral truths through stories and allegories, which are more compelling and effective than abstract philosophical arguments. Moreover, Sidney defends poetry against accusations of being misleading or deceptive. He argues that poetry does not simply fabricate stories but rather uses imagination to present idealized versions of reality that can inspire readers to aspire to higher moral standards. Poetry's role is to offer models of virtue and to appeal to the emotions, which can lead to a deeper understanding and appreciation of moral principles. Sidney also emphasizes the educational value of poetry, asserting that it can both entertain and instruct. He believes that poetry has a unique capacity to influence people's behavior and attitudes by presenting exemplary characters and scenarios that readers can relate to. In this way, poetry serves as a means of moral education, guiding individuals toward virtuous conduct through engaging narratives. 2. How does Sidney address the criticisms of poetry in his An Apology for Poetry? Answer. Sidney addresses several criticisms of poetry in An Apology for Poetry, including the claims that poetry is immoral, deceptive, and useless. He counters these arguments with reasoned responses that highlight the positive aspects of poetry. 1. Immorality. Critics of poetry argue that it promotes immoral behavior by glorifying vice and sensuality. Sidney refutes this by asserting that poetry, when properly crafted, serves to promote virtue and moral behavior. He acknowledges that some poets may indeed produce works that are morally questionable, but he maintains that the fault lies not in poetry itself but in the misuse of the art form. Sidney emphasizes that poetry has the potential to present virtuous ideals and to encourage readers to emulate exemplary characters. By depicting noble actions and virtuous behavior, poetry can inspire readers to pursue moral excellence. 2. Deception. Another criticism Sidney addresses is the claim that poetry is deceptive because it presents fictional narratives as if they were real. Sidney counters this by explaining that poetry's use of imagination and fiction is not meant to deceive but to create a space where moral and philosophical ideas can be explored in a more engaging and impactful manner. He argues that poetry's imaginative quality allows it to present truths in a form that is more accessible and compelling than dry philosophical treatises. Sidney also points out that other forms of literature, such as history and philosophy, often use fictional elements to convey deeper truths, and poetry should not be criticized for employing similar techniques. 3. Uselessness. Some critics argue that poetry is a frivolous and useless pursuit that does not contribute to the practical or intellectual development of individuals. Sidney refutes this by asserting that poetry has a significant educational value. He argues that poetry combines the pleasures of storytelling with the benefits of moral and intellectual instruction. By presenting moral lessons through captivating narratives, poetry can engage readers in a way that fosters both enjoyment and learning. Sidney believes that poetry's ability to appeal to the emotions and imagination makes it a powerful tool for personal growth and moral development. 3. What role does Sidney attribute to poetry in relation to other forms of literature and knowledge? Answer. Sidney distinguishes poetry from other forms of literature and knowledge, such as history and philosophy, by emphasizing its unique qualities and contributions. He argues that poetry occupies a special place among the various branches of learning due to its ability to combine imagination with moral and intellectual instruction. 1. Poetry versus history. Sidney acknowledges that history provides valuable factual accounts of past events and actions, but he argues that it often lacks the imaginative and moral engagement that poetry offers. History may present real events and characters, but it does not always provide the same level of emotional or ethical insight. Sidney contends that poetry can use imaginative storytelling to present idealized versions of reality that highlight moral truths and provide readers with models of virtuous behavior. Poetry's fictional elements allow it to explore ethical dilemmas and human experiences in a way that can be more engaging and thought-provoking than historical accounts. 2. Poetry versus philosophy. Sidney also contrasts poetry with philosophy, which he views as a more abstract and theoretical discipline. While philosophy deals with abstract principles and intellectual arguments, Sidney believes that poetry can present philosophical ideas in a more concrete and accessible form. Poetry can illustrate philosophical concepts through vivid imagery and narrative, making complex ideas more relatable and memorable. Sidney argues that poetry's ability to appeal to the emotions and imagination allows it to convey philosophical truths in a way that resonates more deeply with readers. 3. The combined value of poetry. Sidney's defense of poetry emphasizes its capacity to combine the strengths of both history and philosophy while addressing their limitations. He argues that poetry can provide both moral and intellectual instruction through engaging stories and imaginative scenarios. By presenting moral ideals and philosophical concepts within the context of captivating narratives, poetry can offer readers a holistic and enriching experience that fosters both enjoyment and learning. In summary, Sidney attributes to poetry a unique role that complements and enhances other forms of literature and knowledge. He views poetry as a valuable tool for moral and intellectual development, capable of combining the pleasures of storytelling with the benefits of ethical and philosophical instruction. How does Sidney's concept of poetry compare with Aristotle's definition of poetry in the Poetics? Answer. Sidney's conception of poetry, as presented in An Apology for Poetry, aligns with and diverges from Aristotle's definition in Poetics in several ways. Asterisk 1. Aristotle's definition. In Poetics, Aristotle defines poetry primarily as an art of imitation mimesis. He categorizes poetry as a form of imitation of life and reality through language, rhythm, and harmony. Aristotle emphasizes the role of poetry in representing actions and emotions that lead to catharsis, emotional purification for the audience. According to Aristotle, poetry's purpose is to evoke feelings of pity and fear, leading to a cathartic experience. Asterisk 2. Sidney's perspective. Sidney agrees with Aristotle's notion of poetry as an imitation of life, but he expands on this by highlighting poetry's unique ability to teach moral lessons through imaginative representation. Sidney acknowledges that poetry imitates life, but he emphasizes that its imitation is not limited to mere representation of reality. Instead, poetry offers an idealized version of life that serves to instruct and inspire readers. Sidney argues that poetry should not only imitate but also improve upon reality by presenting idealized virtues and moral truths. Asterisk 3. Moral and educational function. While Aristotle focuses on the emotional impact and cathartic function of poetry, Sidney places greater emphasis on its moral and educational functions. Sidney argues that poetry has a didactic purpose. It teaches and improves its readers by presenting exemplary characters and moral scenarios. This instructional aspect is central to Sidney's defense of poetry, contrasting with Aristotle's more focused discussion on the emotional effects of poetic imitation. Asterisk 4. Imagination and idealization. Sidney underscores the role of imagination in poetry, which allows poets to create idealized versions of reality that can convey moral lessons more effectively. Unlike Aristotle, who emphasizes the representation of actual events and emotions, Sidney highlights how poetry's imaginative quality enables it to present moral and philosophical ideals that might not be found in everyday life. This idealization makes poetry a powerful tool for moral instruction and personal development. In summary, while both Sidney and Aristotle recognize the imitative nature of poetry, Sidney expands the concept to emphasize poetry's role in moral education and idealization. Sidney's view incorporates and builds upon Aristotle's foundational ideas, integrating the moral and instructional dimensions of poetry. 5. How does Sidney's defense of poetry reflect the Renaissance humanist ideals? Answer. Sidney's defense of poetry in An Apology for Poetry is deeply rooted in Renaissance humanist ideals, which emphasize the value of classical learning, the potential of human creativity, and the importance of moral and intellectual development. Here's how Sidney's arguments reflect these humanist principles. Asterisk 1. Classical influence. Renaissance humanism was heavily influenced by the classical literature of Greece and Rome. Sidney's defense of poetry draws upon classical ideas about the value of literature and its role in shaping human character. His arguments echo the works of classical theorists like Aristotle and Horace, who praised the moral and educational functions of poetry. Sidney's appreciation for the classical tradition and his argument that poetry serves to elevate and instruct the human spirit are consistent with the humanist emphasis on the revival of classical knowledge and ideals. Asterisk 2. Human creativity and imagination. Humanism celebrates human creativity and the power of the imagination, which are central to Sidney's defense of poetry. Sidney argues that poetry's imaginative quality allows it to create idealized versions of reality that can instruct and inspire readers. This emphasis on the creative power of the poet reflects the humanist belief in the value of individual creativity and intellectual exploration. Asterisk 3. Moral and intellectual development. A key aspect of Renaissance humanism is the belief in the potential for literature and the arts to contribute to moral and intellectual growth. Sidney's defense of poetry aligns with this ideal by asserting that poetry has the power to teach moral lessons and promote virtue. He argues that poetry's ability to combine entertainment with moral instruction makes it a valuable tool for personal development, reflecting the humanist commitment to the cultivation of virtuous and enlightened individuals. Asterisk 4. Educational function. Humanism places a strong emphasis on education and the development of the individual. Sidney's argument that poetry can serve as an educational tool by presenting moral and philosophical ideas in an engaging manner reflects the humanist focus on education as a means of achieving personal and societal improvement. Sidney's defense of poetry as both entertaining and instructive aligns with the humanist belief in the transformative power of learning in the arts. In summary, Sidney's defense of poetry in An Apology for Poetry is closely aligned with Renaissance humanist ideals. His emphasis on the classical tradition, the creative power of imagination, and the moral and educational functions of poetry reflects the core principles of humanism, which values the arts as a means of cultivating virtue and intellectual growth. 6. What are the implications of Sidney's defense of poetry for the role of poets and poetry in society? Answer. Sidney's defense of poetry in An Apology for Poetry has significant implications for the role of poets and poetry in society. Asterisk 1. Poets as moral guides. Sidney argues that poets have a unique responsibility to guide and instruct society through their work. By presenting idealized versions of virtue and moral behavior, poets can influence public morals and inspire readers to pursue virtuous lives. Sidney's view implies that poets are not just entertainers but moral educators who can shape societal values and attitudes through their writing. Asterisk 2. The societal value of poetry. Sidney's defense elevates poetry from a mere form of entertainment to a significant cultural and educational force. He argues that poetry has the power to affect moral and intellectual improvement, thereby enhancing its societal value. This view implies that poetry plays a crucial role in fostering ethical behavior and intellectual development within society. Asterisk 3. The artistic and intellectual freedom of poets. Sidney's emphasis on the imaginative and creative aspects of poetry underscores the importance of artistic freedom for poets. By defending the use of imagination and fictional elements in poetry, Sidney advocates for the freedom of poets to explore and express their ideas without being constrained by rigid expectations of realism or factual accuracy. This implies that poets should have the liberty to experiment with their art and to convey their ideas in innovative ways. Asterisk 4. The educational role of poetry. Sidney's argument that poetry can both entertain and instruct highlights its educational potential. He implies that poetry should be integrated into educational curricula and cultural institutions as a means of teaching moral and philosophical principles. This view suggests that poetry can play an important role in formal and informal education, contributing to the intellectual and moral development of individuals. Asterisk 5. The enduring relevance of poetry. Sidney's defense of poetry as a vehicle for moral instruction and intellectual engagement implies that poetry has enduring relevance in a changing world. By emphasizing the timeless value of poetry's ability to inspire and educate, Sidney suggests that poetry remains a vital and influential force in society, capable of addressing contemporary issues and resonating with future generations. In summary, Sidney's defense of poetry has profound implications for the role of poets and poetry in society. It positions poets as moral guides, underscores the societal value of poetry, advocates for artistic freedom, highlights the educational potential of poetry, and affirms its enduring relevance. These implications reflect Sidney's belief in the significant and transformative power of poetry. How does Sidney address the issue of poetry's relationship with truth and reality in An Apology for Poetry? Answer. Sidney tackles the issue of poetry's relationship with truth and reality by emphasizing the distinction between literal truth and the deeper truths that poetry can convey. Here's how Sidney addresses this complex relationship. 1. Imaginative truth versus literal truth. Sidney acknowledges that poetry does not always depict literal truth or real events. Instead, he argues that poetry offers a different kind of truth, one that is imaginative and idealized. This imaginative truth allows poets to explore and present moral and philosophical ideas in ways that literal representation cannot. By creating fictional scenarios and characters, poets can illustrate deeper truths about human nature, morality, and the human condition. 2. Poetry is a reflection of higher truths. Sidney contends that poetry's imaginative approach enables it to reflect higher truths and ideals that go beyond the constraints of everyday reality. Through allegory and metaphor, poetry can convey moral and philosophical concepts in a more vivid and compelling manner. For Sidney, the value of poetry lies in its ability to capture and express these abstract truths, making them accessible and meaningful to readers. 3. Poetry's educational role. Sidney argues that poetry's value is not diminished by its departure from literal truth. Instead, poetry's strength lies in its ability to educate and inspire through imaginative representation. By presenting idealized versions of reality, poetry can teach readers about virtue, ethics, and human values. Sidney believes that the moral and intellectual lessons imparted by poetry are of greater importance than strict adherence to literal truth. 4. The role of the poet as a truth seeker. Sidney portrays the poet as a seeker of truth, but one who operates within the realm of imagination rather than strict realism. The poet's role is to explore and express truths that might be obscured by the limitations of factual representation. By using imagination and creativity, the poet can provide insights into human experiences and moral principles that resonate with readers on a deeper level. In summary, Sidney addresses poetry's relationship with truth and reality by distinguishing between literal and imaginative truth. He argues that poetry's value lies in its ability to convey deeper truths and moral lessons through creative and idealized representations, rather than through strict adherence to factual accuracy. 8. What is Sidney's perspective on the role of poetry in shaping public opinion and societal values? Answer. Sidney's perspective on the role of poetry in shaping public opinion and societal values is that poetry has a profound influence on both individuals and society at large. Here's a detailed exploration of his views. 1. Influence on public morality. Sidney believes that poetry has the power to shape public morality by presenting models of virtue and vice. Through its depiction of idealized characters and moral scenarios, poetry can influence readers' perceptions of right and wrong. By presenting virtuous behavior and exemplary conduct, poetry can guide public opinion towards higher moral standards and encourage individuals to emulate positive traits. 2. Promotion of social and political values. Sidney also sees poetry as a means of promoting social and political values. By engaging with contemporary issues and reflecting societal concerns, poetry can address and critique social norms and political practices. Through its ability to capture the spirit of the times and to present alternative perspectives, poetry can contribute to societal change and the evolution of public opinion. 3. Educational impact. The educational function of poetry is central to Sidney's view of its role in society. He argues that poetry's capacity to entertain and instruct makes it a valuable tool for shaping public opinion and values. By combining moral lessons with engaging narratives, poetry can educate readers about important ethical and societal issues in a way that is both memorable and impactful. 4. Emotional engagement and persuasion. Sidney emphasizes poetry's ability to engage readers emotionally and to persuade them of its messages. The emotional power of poetry allows it to resonate with readers on a personal level, making its moral and social lessons more effective. By appealing to the emotions and imagination, poetry can inspire individuals to reflect on their own values and beliefs, thereby influencing public opinion. 5. Cultural influence. Sidney acknowledges that poetry plays a significant role in shaping cultural identity and values. By reflecting and contributing to the cultural milieu, poetry can influence how individuals and societies perceive themselves and their place in the world. Through its artistic and intellectual contributions, poetry helps to define and reinforce cultural norms and values. In summary, Sidney's perspective on the role of poetry in shaping public opinion and societal values highlights its influence on morality, social and political values, education, emotional engagement, and cultural identity. He views poetry as a powerful tool for guiding and transforming public attitudes and behaviors. How does Sidney's An Apology for Poetry reflect the tensions between Renaissance and medieval views of literature and morality? Answer. Sidney's An Apology for Poetry reflects the tensions between Renaissance and medieval views of literature and morality in several ways. 1. Medieval views of literature. During the medieval period, literature was often viewed through a theological lens, with a strong emphasis on its alignment with religious doctrine and moral instruction. Literature was seen primarily as a means to reinforce Christian values and to promote spiritual edification. The medieval perspective often regarded poetry and other forms of literature with suspicion if they were perceived to deviate from religious or moral teachings. 2. Renaissance humanism. The Renaissance brought a renewed interest in classical literature, philosophy, and humanist ideals. This period emphasized the value of human creativity, imagination, and the exploration of secular themes alongside religious ones. Renaissance humanists, including Sidney, sought to reconcile classical literary forms with contemporary moral and philosophical concerns. They viewed literature as a means of intellectual and moral improvement, not solely through religious instruction but also through the exploration of human experiences and ideals. 3. Sidney's integration of classical and Christian values. Sidney's defense of poetry reflects an attempt to bridge medieval and Renaissance perspectives. He acknowledges the importance of moral instruction in literature, a concept rooted in medieval thought, but he also emphasizes the value of imagination, creativity, and the exploration of secular themes, which align with Renaissance humanism. Sidney integrates classical notions of poetic excellence with Christian moral values, arguing that poetry can serve both artistic and educational purposes. 4. Defense against medieval criticism. Sidney addresses criticisms of poetry that stem from medieval attitudes, such as concerns about its potential to corrupt morals or mislead readers. He counters these criticisms by asserting that poetry, when properly crafted, can promote virtue and moral development. By defending poetry against such accusations, Sidney challenges the medieval view that literature must strictly conform to religious teachings and demonstrates a more nuanced understanding of literature's role in society. 5. Advocacy for literary freedom. Sidney's emphasis on the imaginative and creative aspects of poetry reflects a shift from medieval constraints to Renaissance ideals of artistic freedom. He advocates for the poet's liberty to explore a wide range of themes and to present moral lessons through imaginative storytelling. This perspective represents a departure from the medieval focus on adherence to religious orthodoxy and reflects a Renaissance belief in the value of artistic expression and intellectual exploration. In summary, Sidney's An Apology for Poetry reflects the tensions between Renaissance and medieval views by integrating classical and Christian values, defending poetry against medieval criticisms, and advocating for literary freedom. His work represents a synthesis of Renaissance humanism and medieval moral concerns, highlighting the evolving role of literature in reflecting and shaping societal values. 10. How does Sidney address the relationship between poetry and other forms of art, such as drama and music, in An Apology for Poetry? Answer. In An Apology for Poetry, Sidney addresses the relationship between poetry and other forms of art, such as drama and music, by highlighting the interconnectedness and distinctive roles of these art forms. Here's how Sidney approaches this topic. 1. Poetry and drama. Sidney acknowledges that drama, like poetry, is a form of poetic expression. He recognizes the close relationship between poetry and drama, noting that both share the qualities of imagination, narrative, and moral instruction. Sidney views drama as a subset of poetry that uses dialogue and performance to convey its messages. He emphasizes that, while drama has a unique capacity to engage audiences through live performance and the portrayal of action, it retains the essential qualities of poetry, including its ability to present moral and philosophical themes. 2. Poetry and music. Sidney also addresses the relationship between poetry and music, recognizing that music, like poetry, has the power to affect emotions and convey artistic expression. He acknowledges that poetry and music often work together to enhance the overall impact of a work, with music providing an additional layer of emotional and aesthetic experience. Sidney suggests that music can complement poetry by setting its words to melody, thereby enriching the poetic expression and making it more memorable. Asterisk 3. Distinctive roles. While Sidney acknowledges the connections between poetry, drama, and music, he also highlights the distinctive roles of each art form. He argues that poetry's strength lies in its ability to combine imaginative storytelling with moral and philosophical instruction. Drama adds the element of performance and action, while music enhances the emotional and sensory experience. Each art form has its own unique qualities and contributions, but they all share the common goal of engaging and instructing audiences. Asterisk 4. Interdisciplinary influence. Sidney's discussion of poetry in relation to drama and music reflects an awareness of the interdisciplinary nature of the arts. He recognizes that different art forms often influence and complement one another, contributing to a richer and more diverse artistic experience. By acknowledging the interplay between poetry, drama, and music, Sidney. How does Sidney argue against the critics who view poetry as morally dangerous or corrupting? Answer. In An Apology for Poetry, Sidney addresses concerns about poetry being morally dangerous or corrupting by presenting several key arguments. Asterisk 1. The moral purpose of poetry. Sidney argues that poetry, when properly composed, serves a moral purpose by teaching and promoting virtue. He contends that poetry is designed to instruct and improve its readers, rather than to corrupt them. By presenting exemplary characters and virtuous behavior, poetry can lead readers towards moral betterment and away from vice. Asterisk 2. The misinterpretation of poetry. Sidney suggests that critics who view poetry as corrupting often misunderstand its nature and purpose. He argues that poetry is misinterpreted when its imaginative elements are seen as promoting moral behavior. Instead, Sidney asserts that poetry's imaginative representation allows it to explore moral and philosophical themes in a way that encourages readers to reflect on and aspire to higher ethical standards. Asterisk 3. The role of the poet. Sidney emphasizes the role of the poet as a responsible creator who aims to guide and instruct rather than to mislead. He argues that the poet's intention is to convey moral truths and inspire positive values through their work. The poet's ability to engage and persuade readers through imagination and creativity should be seen as a means of promoting moral values, not as a cause of moral corruption. Asterisk 4. Comparison with other arts. Sidney defends poetry by comparing it to other arts that are also subject to moral scrutiny, such as painting and music. He argues that, like these other arts, poetry can be used for good or ill depending on the intent of the artist and the interpretation of the audience. The potential for moral danger exists in any art form, but this does not invalidate the inherent value of poetry. Asterisk 5. The positive impact of poetry. Sidney highlights examples of poetry that have had a positive impact on society by fostering virtues and promoting ethical behavior. He points out that many classical and contemporary poets have used their work to advocate for moral improvement and social reform. By focusing on these positive contributions, Sidney argues that poetry's overall impact is beneficial rather than harmful. In summary, Sidney argues against the view that poetry is morally dangerous by emphasizing its educational and moral purposes, addressing misunderstandings about its imaginative elements, highlighting the poet's responsibility, comparing it with other arts, and pointing to its positive societal impact. 12. Discuss the significance of Sidney's use of classical references in An Apology for Poetry. Answer. Sidney's use of classical references in An Apology for Poetry is significant for several reasons. Asterisk 1. Authority and tradition. Classical references lend authority to Sidney's arguments by aligning his defense of poetry with the esteemed tradition of classical literature and thought. By invoking classical authors such as Aristotle, Horace, and Plato, Sidney situates his arguments within a respected intellectual lineage, reinforcing the credibility of his defense. Asterisk 2. Integration of classical and contemporary views. Sidney integrates classical ideas with contemporary Renaissance perspectives, demonstrating how classical literary theory can be adapted to address modern concerns about poetry. This synthesis highlights Sidney's engagement with both classical tradition and Renaissance humanism, showing how he builds upon established ideas while introducing new insights. Asterisk 3. Illustration of literary excellence. Classical references serve to illustrate the qualities of great literature and poetry. By citing examples from classical works, Sidney underscores the timeless nature of literary excellence and the enduring value of poetic principles. These references help to define what constitutes good poetry and why it remains relevant and influential. Asterisk 4. Moral and educational themes. Classical references also reinforce Sidney's arguments about poetry.